We just heard Override the Overture from Dismember's Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. This is Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm Mark.
And I'm Jason. And once again, kind of back-to-back weeks of similar sounds.
Filth.
Yeah, filthy razor. I would say this is the ultimate buzzsaw guitar record, if you will.
It's the opposite end of the spectrum of what Entombed did. You know, with their Stockholm sound, this is like the
expansive,
the counter
bluesy,
of it.
Based in kind of punk rock a little bit more, whereas this is like more a more sharpened weapon, if you will.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the gain and the overdrive is in full effect of this, and I think you can hear a lot more of the kind of like direct D-beat punk influence kind of going on with this as well, especially the Fred Espy's drums that are always slightly behind, they feel like they're kind of behind the guitars or whatever, which I think kind of propels the whole thing forward.
And that barbarism is always like there, even when they like add melody. Entombed can add melody and make it almost something like more rock and roll almost with the melody, whereas when Dismember is adding the melody, they're almost like texturizing the sort of like brutality a little bit. It's never in like a Gothenburg's like melodic Swedish death metal sort of way, or even a bluesy rock and roll kind of thing.
Is like kind of, even Left Hand Path is pretty kind of groove based, and I think Dismember has hooks, but they're not the same kind of. They're more disturbing, because this was because I really dug Left Hand Path, but hearing this when it came out, as soon as you hear that, after the thunder and the rain starting in the beginning,
riff is classic,
like quintessential.
Like
and I was just like transfixed when I heard that back in the day.
Yeah, that might be the sort of the quintessential like buzzsaw tremolo riff of the entire. It's really the foundation of almost the entire Swedish death metal scene. I mean, Left Hand Path is like the genesis of it all, but like Dismember is almost like the band, and Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, is the record that sort of refines that down to like the blueprint from which most other bands are going to steal from. Because I've hardly ever heard another Swedish death metal record sound like Clandestine or Left Hand Path.
No, I mean, the guitar tone was replicated a little bit. Like Nirvana 2002 has the same kind of guitar tone,
but never in terms of like riffing. The way they riff or even songwrite. It's just like it's a left of center approach, and that's what makes a guy like Nicky Anderson so like interesting. Is he's not like a traditional metal guy at all times.
Well, and him being the drummer and primary songwriter of Entombed, Fred Espy is the primary songwriter and drummer of Dismember. So you had that weird kind of like these like kind of mad genius kids, and at this point these guys were still in high school.
Well, they even talk about like coming into high school like with their like vinyl record and showing it off to people, and people didn't really take them seriously as a band until like they're like, hey, we got a record. Then a few weeks later, after doing a couple of mini tours, they sold like 25,000 records, and
which is pretty insane. I mean, by today's standards, that's unbelievable.
And and Override the Overture is sort of the kickoff. And speaking of Nicky Anderson, it's the only the only song we're going to be playing that doesn't feature a Nicky Anderson solo.
Yeah, Dave Bloomquist, the other lead guitar player, is doing the leads on this. Let's run down the roster of who's in this band.
Let's do it.
We've got Mr. Matty Karki on vocals, David Bloomquist, I believe it's pronounced, on guitar, Robert Senneback on rhythm guitar, Richard Cabeza, also known as Richard Damon. On bass, and Fred Espy on drums.
Yeah.
And this was actually it was produced by Thomas Skogsberg, same as Entombed, but Espy was the kind of the co-producer of the thing as well, which kind of started his career as a producer. He kind of gets a career
in working with at Sunlight, doesn't he?
Yeah. He becomes kind of like the next guy at Sunlight.
That's pretty cool. He Espy thanks Nicky Anderson for kind of ultimate inspiration in the liner notes to this record as well, talking about the connection between these two. And Nicky drew the logo for Dismember, the famous story, of course, that he ran out of room, correct? Because
it was supposed to be Dismemberizer.
Yeah.
And then, the piece of paper was too small. So it's like,
Dismember sounds good. And in terms of, some of the other iconic things that are happening as an overall theme, before we start kind of talking more about the music and the record, the songs itself, you've got a classic Dan Seagrave cover, similar to he's the guy that did Altars of Madness and Left Hand Path, Obituary, Cause of Death, Sepultura. Did he do Arise or just Beneath the Remains, or neither?
I don't think he did either of those.
Why am I thinking that? Maybe it's just Cause of Death. I'm thinking, but
Andreas Marshall, I think, did those Sepultura ones.
Yep,
I believe you're right. That went on to do a lot of Blind Guardian stuff too,
and he did some Dimmu Borgir and Hammerfall stuff too as well.
Yes, he did.
Andreas Marshall, but so you've got the classic picture Mark and I were just talking about. This I think is one of the best metal photos of all time.
Oh, absolutely. You got these 5 guys covered in pig blood, no shirts on. Well, except for Matty Carkey, because he's a little bit on the tubby side.
Yeah.
Covered in that with bullet belts, leather pants, and like inverted crosses.
That upside down cross against the pig's blood is pretty iconic.
They look pretty serious, and this was like the first band that I saw that this was pre I guess the big wave of black metal coming through with all that kind of the photography where you see guys looking really kind of crazy and outside of anything you'd ever seen before. But seeing this, we're just like, wow, these guys are awesome, and they're young and they're like our age and doing this stuff. And this was the first record that I remember. I was still living with my folks at the time, and my mom saw this, and that's when we had the sit down talk.
Metal talk.
And then she never had a problem with it since. It's like, well, you're not out sacrificing goats. I didn't think you were, but I wanted to have that conversation with you. And I was showing her all the stuff, and I was like, I don't believe, this is just for effect, kind of thing. And then when you start doing the magazine and like you're actually really involved in it, so this was that big transitional record for the relationship with metal, my folks.
That's really cool. And I mean, it's interesting that of all the ones that she would cherry pick, it would be this one, because this record, of course,
I think it all had to do with that photo being out.
Photo. Wow. Something about this record kind of brought a lot of, I guess, negative publicity. We'll talk later about Skinner Alive and some of the stuff that happened with that. But it's just funny because reading interviews with these guys, they seem so like innocent by nature.
Yeah, I think it was 1992, right before they did
Indecent
Obscene. We saw them down in Detroit, and went and actually interviewed them, with their tape recorders and whatever. Yep. The most laid back guys in the world. We talked with Matty Carkey, and he was sitting there, with his glasses on and sweatshirt, looking, kind of fatherly.
Yeah,
ended up talking about like Led Zeppelin and all this other stuff. I'm like, man, these guys are.
What's the other thing? Like in terms of influences and stuff, they, a lot of these guys come from like a classic heavy metal sense, like
especially Espy.
Yeah, I mean, they were talking about Espy's favorite band, of course, Iron Maiden, and then
as is Carkey's.
Yeah, Carkey, and
Blomqvist, if you can tell by his leads later on.
Yeah, but then Blomqvist was also talking about, I think it was Blomqvist, about the influence that like Ritchie Blackmore and Deep Purple had on him and stuff like that. So.
Well, then the whole influence of, Espy starting out as a kid being into like Kiss and Iron Maiden and all this stuff, and then Nicky Anderson turning him on to all this like hardcore punk stuff.
Yeah, and of course they really all came through the thrash scene, but then Death Leprosy and Scream Bloody Gore and some of that kind of stuff started to pop up.
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting that Espy and I think Espy and Blomqvist were both talking about how like what turned them on to guitar, or where they were attracted guitar wise, wasn't to like the technicality sort of side of things. Like they said that Trey from Morbid Angel was never like a guy they looked up to. Like it
was interesting, but it didn't do anything for him.
It didn't grab him. Neither did like the sort of style of Kerry King and Hanneman. Which is interesting, because if you think about it, like this is such a bludgeoning, energetic record that you would think that like Slayer would be, one of their primary influences, and it may have been in terms of the energy.
Big Rain and Blood vibe
for sure,
energy, but there's that punk energy which Slayer kind of took on as well.
Well, not just the punk energy, but also like their leads and stuff like that. And this may have been the Nicky Anderson part of it. Were never like as like caustic as like what Kerry King
they're much more rock and roll.
Yeah.
So, they're actually kind of, because Nicky Anderson's no denier of being a huge Kiss fan, and there's definitely some Ace Frehley isms to the guitar.
Well, and all you have to do is listen to the stuff, the Helicopter stuff that he does later. To hear the Stooges and MC5 and the Kiss, the sort of 70s
garage rock,
garagey kind of stuff. So, but. It's a record that often gets lost in the shuffle when the spotlight is always on, Entombed, Left Hand Path. But as we were talking about before, I think that this often maybe influenced more bands in a way than Entombed did, because it was just a more like focused, like more metallic version of what Entombed was kind of doing.
And I know a lot of people that have been listening to stuff forever, and journalists and whatnot, and just fans in general, that would actually go on record saying this is the superb record over the two. And it all came down to timing, really. It was like a year apart. I think Dismember was recorded closer to, like, the records could have come out almost concurrently.
They couldn't find a record label to put them out
until Nuclear Blast jumped on. So they're kind of sitting on this thing forever. So it all basically I think came down to timing, and then just all the weird, because back at that point I don't think anybody realized what the scene was going to become.
Yeah.
And it was a bunch of like very incestuous kind of stuff as far as people trading riffs, trading band members.
Sure.
And actually, Dismember starts up in like 88, I think.
Yep.
And then ends up doing a demo, breaking up. Then Mike Amott and who else started Carnage?
Johan Leva and Dordevik, I think, were the three.
Were they the three?
Yep.
And then they end up, Maddie Karki ends up joining, Etsby ends up joining.
And Blomqvist.
And Blomqvist ends up joining that. Record Dark Recollections on Earache. Break up.
Then that breaks up.
Amott goes over to Carcass.
And then
it all comes
Dordevik
back
joins
to
every other band without ever playing on them.
Exactly.
And then
the biggest charlatan in the scene.
Yeah, and then those three guys kind of become. And in a moment here, we're going to sample the tasty treats about Carnage for a moment as kind of a comparison. But
because really they're so intermingled as far as like Dismember demo tracks were coming onto Carnage records, and then later they'd take Torn Apart. I think is that the one we're going to be
we're going to play some Torn Apart.
Ends up showing up on the Pieces EP that comes out right after this.
Yeah.
So,
and the other thing, one of the reasons why we decided to do this back-to-back weeks with Autopsy is because really Autopsy is like the band that informs the Dismember sound in a huge way.
Autopsy was reading a lot of stuff about the scene back in that day. Death was big with people, and a lot of other bands are coming to the surface, but Autopsy was the one that I think pushed everybody over the top to
especially in Sweden.
Yeah, to definitely show this group of young Swedes what was possible with death metal.
Yeah, and and so if you having listened to that show maybe last week, or maybe you're listening to them back to back, for all I know, it's kind of an interesting way to kind of do that comparison to see like how their sound sort of transferred over to this, especially if you're not familiar with either of those bands. If you're a newcomer to some
and
of this stuff.
This record has quite a different feel, I think, than the other Dismember records. It's much more visceral.
Yeah. Its claws are out.
Because I think after this, everything kind of. They kind of fall into their formula. Not for any worse, but
it's hard to capture that energy and the exuberance of that very first moment. That big bang kind of thing. And I think what this record has always been able to do, and even earlier Dismember kind of stuff compared to the later stuff, is make up for their lack of technical prowess with sort of just
energy and enthusiasm.
Yeah.
And you hear this, and then Pieces like amped it up so much more. Like as soon as you hear that record kick off, it's like unbelievably brutal, almost similar to how the Stranger Aeons EP was for Entombed, where it was just like bludgeoning.
Yep.
And then there's only so far you can really go at that, and then kind of
and then Decent Obscene and Massive Killing Capacity kind of play on some of the catchier like hooks and stuff like that.
Indecent and Obscene definitely is all about the hook.
Yeah.
I mean, every song has 2 or 3 like unbelievable hooks in it.
Yeah.
And I think that's when they kind of came into their own as songwriters without outside help.
And I think that probably pissed some people off, not to go too far outside like an
Massive Killing Capacity pissed off a lot of people.
Yeah, and that was the first record I ever heard from these guys. Speak of,
I mean, I was kind of pissed when it first came out because it seemed a little bit neutered, but going back now, it's like not really at all.
No,
that was the first introduction of Blomqvist really kind of doing the Dave Murray Iron Maiden solos for sure.
Yeah, so it's interesting, an interesting trajectory for the band. But again, this is a record that I think Mark and I would both hold up, face to face with Left Hand Path and say, hey, this can go toe to toe in terms of being the Swedish death metal record.
It's the opposite end of the spectrum.
Yeah. And but Carnage, that we're going to hear in just a second, I guess. You can get the earlier Dismember demos on a collection now. What's that?
Candlelight put it out. I think it's just called Dismember Demos, like 88 to 90 or something. Yeah.
Yep. And some of those songs became Carnage songs, and then vice versa became Dismember songs again. Yeah. A couple of them, like Torn Apart or whatever. Because
I think some of that, I mean, definitely with Torn Apart, you can hear the Mike Amott influence on the leads.
Sure.
And much more kind of a virtuoso guitar player.
Brighter, with a lot of, the soloing and stuff.
So it was kind of a neat counterbalance, but then what they do is, take what they kind of refine together, and then on the Pieces EP, kind of erase him out of the picture altogether, really.
Absolutely. So by comparison, here's Torn Apart from Carnage's Dark Recollections from 1990.
I don't feel desire to enter the realm of death. man, he's tearing my soul apart. You will live to suffer in the burning of the moon. Falls out on your knees in the image of torment. Evil detriment is tearing my soul apart.
Yeah, we're back from some Carnage moments.
Torn apart, evil gentleman, tearing your soul apart.
What kind of things do you hear that make, I guess, Carnage a little bit different from what Dismember's going to do with like an Everflowing Stream? I mean, what do you think like Karki and Etsby and those guys learn from that? Either elements they take or elements they leave behind. Besides the solo and stuff.
If you listen to the Dismember demos, the songwriting's a little bit because Fred Etsby was the one that came up with a lot of the riffs, you know, and a lot of the lyrics, and ended up kind of workshopping it in the studio to have other people kind of put their stamp on it. Because I don't think he's necessarily a great guitar player as far as being able to pull the stuff off live, but you know, being creative and coming up with the riffs. I think the whole Carnage thing was kind of just like a really kind of like quick school of how to be a good musician.
Yeah, kind of made him grow up pretty quick.
Yeah, and figure out how to put songs together even better. Because I think Amat's an unbelievable musician. He's not always the best songwriter, but he's a really great player.
Yeah, he's a texturizer. Almost, like what he was able to bring to Carcass when he leaves Carnage and stuff like that.
Yeah, he totally like upped their game in the solo department.
Yeah, and there's that great quote in the Carnage booklet where Amat is talking about having already gone to England, and then when Like an Ever Flowing Stream sort of comes out, somebody put it in his hand, and he goes, "It's good to know that something good came out of Carnage." You know, like that was a proud moment for him as
Carnage,
like a father figure or something.
They were always kind of back burner band because the record actually came out on Necrosis, which was a split or kind of like a sub label of Earache.
Yeah, Necrosis wasn't that like something? Didn't Jeff Walker have something to do with Necrosis?
I think he was kind of like the A&R guy or something with that. I could be wrong, but that sounds right.
I think you're right. Yeah,
but that was actually, it was done as a split album with Cadaver, the hallucination anxiety record.
Is Cadaver that
Norwegian band?
Yeah,
who'd end up becoming like Cadaver Inc. later on, and actually they were Carcass-ish in approach, but sounded nothing like them at all. Just they're kind of one of the first Norwegian bands to really get any kind of exposure
outside of the mayhem and some of the
at this point, like as a death metal band, because there really wasn't a whole lot of death metal at the time in Norway. So
and then we get back to this record and Like an Ever Flowing Stream, and when did this? It came out in 91, like mid-year. Do you have any idea when? The early part of the year? I want to say
like July or something.
Okay, I could be summertime or whatever. And you've got guys, Matty Karki vocally, as I'm sure you heard on Override the Overture, just like L.G. Petrov was, I think, schooled in a way by, Chris Reifert's approach and sort of that.
A little bit of Chuck in there as well, but there's, Dismember always was a little bit more on the guttural side, I think, as well, but it was always... This first couple years and first couple waves of band, there's that weird enunciation that you could actually almost understand. Same with Carl Willits from Bolt Thrower and things like that. Even Dave Ingram from Benediction, and Barney Greenway. All these guys had really kind of guttural voices, but you could actually hear, if you were versed enough in the music, you could understand kind of what they're saying.
Do you think that was like almost oddly unique to the European death metal scene as opposed to like the American, which was so like cupped vocals,
except for Morbid Angel?
Yeah, Dave
Vincent kind of had more of a European vibe.
Chuck too, because Chuck's approach was from a raspier sensibility.
But you go to like the New York and some of the other Florida stuff, like Obituary. Slowly We Rot had no lyrics at all.
Singing,
he was just making noises, which is kind of goofy. But there was always that a little bit more precision, I think, in the Swedish scene especially. And it's weird because the whole the Swedish kind of metal scene bypassed thrash almost altogether. And yet at the time, like right before this, the kind of the 88, 89, 90 era of death metal came out, it was a huge crust scene over there. Yeah. Which was kind of like a couple years behind where the US was, the mid 80s hardcore stuff. Yeah. And where stuff was like in the UK and like Conflict and all that kind of stuff was coming out. So that was like, they're right on the cusp of that. They bypassed thrash altogether and bam, we got Swedish death metal.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's weird too, because you hear some of that in Dismember, like you hear some of the grindy stuff more influential on it, like a song like Soon to Be Dead, which is a minute and 55 seconds, has a real like almost a Terrorizer Repulsion kind of background to it, almost in how immediate it is,
and the groove they throw into it is not like what Entombed necessarily would have done. I guess it's kind of the same, a similar kind of approach, but it's definitely, you can hear like the Extreme Noise Terrorisms and Chaos UK and that kind of stuff kind of popping through, just this really kind of simple rhythm that's not at all heavy metal by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah, and Soon to Be Dead didn't it have wasn't this the first video?
It was the first video.
First Dismember video? I've never seen it.
This might be the one with Frasby where he's dressed up like Christ and turns around and smiles as he's crucified, but
okay.
I could be wrong.
Yeah, I've heard about that one.
Because that's on...
Isn't that from...
That's from Indecent or Obscene, because it's actually the fold out that I have of the original. Okay. It has him smiling on the crucifix of the crown of thorns. Yeah. A fake beard.
He pulls the fake beard off pretty well. I think I was convinced of that as a kid.
I mean, Dismember always was the most... Compared to like the US stuff, the covers, it was all illustrated stuff. It had a lot of the Vincent Locke, zombies eating each other out and that kind of crap. But like just the covers that Dismember had, and first, not necessarily the covers, but the accompanying photography. And the Pieces EP is my absolute favorite.
It's awesome.
Where it's 5 heads as a pentagram with their hair tied together. It's like, who would have thought of that? Like, it's a bunch of dismembered heads.
Yeah. Well,
like,
and Decent Obscene is
perfect.
pretty nasty too. Like somebody getting, like the guts.
Oh, it's like it's somebody's chest that's tore open with like a dismembered like, metal stamp on it. It's pretty fantastic.
I mean, so there is that sense of humor kind of aspect to it. That meta moment. That Dismember almost knew that they're kind of in on the joke a little bit, but yet
and like
everything's valuable about their music.
Yeah, like what's more extreme than doing these painted covers is like these almost like horror movie prop effects and stuff.
Exactly. Some art pieces, if you will, with found art and stuff. But so we're gonna go from Soon to Be Dead and into Bleed for Me, and then And So Is Life. What any thoughts in particular on these 3 tunes?
Well, and So Is Life has that great. It's the precursor to the Nagelfar, where you hear the match light, and right in the beginning you hear that.
Well, and then you also hear some texturizing with some keyboards in that song too, like at the very beginning. Yeah, but it's not like overdone. It's just like there's a little tiny bit there.
It's something to kind of like be it up in the studio, but it doesn't. You don't lose it by not hearing it live.
Yeah, and I remember reading that when they wrote And So Is Life. Etsby and those guys said they were listening to a lot of atheists, and so they were trying to think of like a different way to approach the songwriting. Now, it doesn't sound like an atheist tune in terms of like it's not like technical death metal, but you can tell it stands out different from the previous 3 songs that we'll have heard up to this point. And the tremola in the middle, that breakdown in the middle, And So Is Life is sort of bathed in Autopsy and Slayer and just very brutal, very epic. It's combining brutal and epic in a weird way that only I think Entombed was able to do at this point.
I think there's like 4 good breakdowns in this song.
Yeah. Well, and then ridiculous. Another one that happens later, they said they were trying to, maybe accidentally, but they're sort of accidentally ripping off Twisted Sister Burn in Hell in this song.
See that kind of in the structural kind of
like at the minute 54 mark or something like that.
Yeah.
I remember him saying in that Decibel Hall of Fame interview. So, and then Bleed for Me, one thing I want to say, which is really cool, is the breakdown in the middle has this cool like spoken word thing from Fred Etsby, and he'll do that later on in Death Sleep, kind of at the very beginning.
From Dream to Dream.
Yeah. And it's kind of got like a cool Dead Skin Mask kind of feel to it, that creepy, like, monotone sort of talking to it. And you hear a little bit of boogie groove at the beginning of that tune as well, which they don't hit too many grooves on this record, as Mark said before, but that's one to sort of pay attention to.
Yeah.
So. But all right, cool. So we've got Soon to Be Dead, Bleed for Me, and So Is Life. And so is life, bleed for me, and soon to be dead. All positive, uplifting.
Exactly.
Tunes. At least there's something thematic on this record, I guess. Kind of like an Autopsy.
And they weren't quite as blatant as stuff like, Fucked with a Knife.
Yeah.
Song titles like that. They kind of like elicit some kind of thought or, conjuring up imagery and stuff,
Well, and I think that's interesting. Like, the next set of music we're going to hear, we'll have Skinner Alive. And I mean, I just can't really like figure out like why of all songs that this one in particular was so controversial compared to, some of the stuff that Cannibal Corpse or Autopsy were doing, because it's basically like kind of it's like the killer from Silence of the Lambs, like giving like a personal narrative or something like that.
Well, I think it was like one of their neighbors or something.
Yeah, he said it was his neighbor like killed his wife or something.
But the big thing was it was the UK Decency Commission that ended up, they caught it coming in as an import. And
well, they were looking for drugs or something like that. And they saw it was being shipped to like Plastic Heads in Germany distribution or something like that.
Cracked the thing open. Then they actually defended themselves in court successful.
Yeah, Maddie and Fred Etzby had to go.
But I think it was probably more the having any kind of like female something. It was an actual
violence towards
women, but it was actually something that could be. Similar to like what a lot of like the Ozzy stuff, it could be replicated by somebody, the altar sacrifice controversy kind of shit, where people could actually like perform this act.
And I'm sure they weren't doing themselves any favors with like the photos of them covered in pig's blood and stuff like that, because.
But when are people gonna understand that there's? I mean, it's just like theater.
Yeah.
Like Macbeth and all this shit. It's incredibly violent. Watch a Kurosawa movie. It's violent, but it's for effect. It's not just to wallow in it.
Yeah, and it's the problem with a lot of people is nobody has any sense of humor about any of this stuff. They can have a sense of humor about like a horror film, but for some reason they've always taken music more seriously.
Yeah. I don't think like rap has fallen under the same scrutiny. Not like the early '90s stuff, but like the later on stuff where it's all just about financial gain and getting ass and drinking.
Yeah.
That stuff doesn't come as much under scrutiny as violence. But then movies,
well, because
it's the opposite way.
That's under the guise of the sort of false promises of capitalism and the American dream, right? You know, like bitches and hoes and that
but
sort
then,
of thing.
If
It's
that
very
kind of stuff
patriarchal
is in film, nudity, sexual content, that's a big no-no, but then violence is okay
in America.
In America.
Because the puritanical bullshit foundation of which this country was founded upon.
Our religious freedom that we don't necessarily have.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I mean, any country that's founded by people that were so religiously extreme that they were kicked out of like a backwards thinking Europe really tells you something. I mean, those had to be some whack job motherfuckers.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's almost ingrained in our system, I know my host brother, one of my host brothers from England, when I student taught there, he was a teacher at a Catholic school and he taught like religious studies. I mean, he was very like, like devout and stuff like that. And he came over here a few times and he's just like, you guys are fucking crazy. He goes, I don't know what. He goes, I teach religious studies and like you guys are weird about religion here. It's almost scary, and that's coming from him. He's not even like a person like you or I, where we're already like, going to be critical of any kind of organized sort of stuff. But yeah, so it's odd that song, I mean, I don't know, maybe they were looking for a target. They wanted to make an example. They thought, oh, here's some dumb, young Swedish guys that we can like. Just
I imagine. I don't know all the specifics of it, but it is probably the most evocative title. Yeah, as far as something that someone who's not initiated with this would actually see it and like, ooh, I don't like that.
But I guess outside of like, I know Cannibal Corpse has been banned in like Germany and some other things like that, but that's more almost for their covers. It's never been about, like Fucked with a Knife is such like an evocative, like that's a way scarier image to me on some level. I guess
stripped, raped, and strangled.
Yes, I mean, there's some really like
great song, but terrible.
And Skinner Alive is brutal. But a year before, in 1990, Silence of the Lambs took home the Oscar for Best Picture, and no one looked at that as like, oh, people are going to see that movie and they're going to like copycat crime. They're going to become either cannibals or Wild Bill, Buffalo Bill kind of like murders and Ed Gein type shit. And it's so weird. I don't know.
It's just the whole moral authority thing is terrible because all the people that bark the loudest about it are always the most, kind of sick and perverse.
Yeah, sure. They're the ones in close quarters doing really odd things because they're not in touch with like their own humanity.
Pedophile rings or, all this other shit. It's just unbelievable. So everybody just live and let live. And if your neighbors, what they're doing is freaking you out, don't worry about it.
Sure.
Fix your own life. Jesus.
Exactly. So... But before we get to Skinner Alive, upbeat kind of tune, we've got a tune that really sets in motion a series of events that will affect Dismember, I think, down the road, especially. And that's the Dismembered song.
It's their first foray into the epic, which they'll kind of reflect again in Death Sleep, the closing track of the record. But then they go on, I'm spacing out on some of the, it's not Seeing Red.
Dreaming in Red.
Yeah, I mean, they kind of, each record has one of these kind of songs. This one actually had two, but
yeah. And Nina was it Nina on Massive Killing Capacity?
Yeah, I think so.
Nina or something like that. There's a tune that's
Nemia or something.
I can't remember.
I don't remember what it was now.
But yeah, like it seems like every record kind of has something like that.
And it's kind of the quintessential Iron Maiden riff, but played in a minor chord. More simply.
I kind of made a note that it's like Iron Maiden in the guise of like the way that Death, like the opener, like the opening kind of like riffs to like Pull the Plug or to Spiritual Healing or The Philosopher, where it's like this like separate from the rest of the song, which the rest of the song is like a typical, kind of brutality, death metal type tune, but this almost
kind of very,
brighter intro or something like that.
Very kind of Anglo-classical approach.
Yeah, for sure. And it's about 2 minutes of instrumental stuff kind of mixed in before one of the like Etsby's probably all-time classic blast beats comes in and just like pummels you. And
his blasts, similarly to the rest of his playing, were slightly off, that differentiated. I mean, even Bloodbath talk about the Etsby beat, because it's weird. It's not off time, but it's not just like a straight 4/4 beat or whatever.
Yeah, Bloodbath has done a really awesome job of sort of like mimicking that on some of their records.
Yeah, Martin Axelrod or whatever.
Axelrod,
I have never heard it replicated outside of Etsby. Even the new drummer for Dismember doesn't necessarily do it. He does kind of his own thing. Like Etsby had such a unique stamp on his drumming.
Well, I think of like a tune like on Ways to the Grave, the opening tune to the first Bloodbath full length, which escapes my memory right offhand. It's got the
3-word title.
Something, probably. Who knows? It's not Nightmares Made Flesh, because that's the one with Peter
Tägtgren on it.
From Tägtgren. But yeah, Ways to the Grave has this like super like kind of melodic kind of chorusy part, and then it just drops into that that crazy like Edge of Sanity meets Dismember.
It's similar, it's similar to what the hell? I'm spacing out names. Benny Larson. That's right.
From Edge of Sanity. Yeah. Episode 2.
Pandemonium and
good old episode 2, the very first band we ever did.
Yes.
And I think the third band we ever did was Dismember, right? Our favorite classics of Dismember.
Yeah, and then both were followed right after. Yeah. So that was another reason to kind of do this, is that we didn't necessarily get to focus quite so much. It was, it was a kind of career-wide thing. So I could see doing maybe another one for Dismember. I'm not sure exactly which album.
We could do a justify your shitty opinion for Massive Killing Capacity. I could.
I think that's actually got pretty good critical appraise.
Is it okay now?
No, but I think
you
at
guys
the time,
slagged a lot. I remember.
Well, it was that weird era in metal when everything was starting to diverge a little bit, and I think it was the same year or maybe it was the previous year to Dissection, Storm of the Light's Bane.
No, same year. It was Slaughter of the Soul, Storm of the Light's Bane. Yeah, so there was a lot of weird. Nuclear Blast had a kind of a lot of caveat at that point. Hypocrisy was putting out like Roswell 47, and
that was when I was I was working at Relapse, and for a promo giveaway for Massive Killing Capacity, they had a rusty chainsaw with a Dismember logo silkscreened on the blade.
Which that sort of that image of that like kind of like I don't know, robotic cyborg kind of
looked
creature.
Like a bolter recovery.
Yeah, it looked pretty awesome. But that chainsaw like really sort of fits with the weight of the Dismember riff, the chainsaw buzzsaw kind of riff,
absolutely.
Yeah. So, and that's what you hear a lot in Dismembered after the blast beat sort of kicks in. You get this menacing kind of, I mentioned to Mark, Sepultura kind of schizophrenia type riff, which you said was another band that kind of influenced them quite a bit. So.
Yeah, and that the Decibel number 50, though I think it's number 50, isn't the one I did the cover for?
Yeah, that's the one with number 70. That's your classic Glenn Danzig.
50, I think, was the first one I started doing illustrations in, but 70. So it's they talk about that right in the beginning a little bit.
Which you have a nice ode to your favorite cover with pieces there.
That's pretty cool that I get to, one of my favorite death metal albums, and, not only do I get to do the cover, but I get to do this little thing of, Dio and of Matty Karki,
with his severed head being held by his hair, so.
Which is a take on an EC cover
by
Johnny Craig, but.
And then we get Skinner Alive, and musically, I mean, it's a pretty short, pretty punchy, kind of just standard death metal tune. But I mean, I don't know if there's anything that jumped out to you about it. I
mean, the vocal line, the vocal kind of pattern, I think is more present than in some of the other songs. Like, it's actually pretty catchy, kind of like chorus, which seems weird for death metal. That it plays for people that are like, what? It's not a sing along chorus. Like,
it's called Skinner Alive. Yeah, sing along. It's like getting a strip dick and strangled. You know, I mean, that seems sort of like.
I mean, it's pretty vocally, and the way like the vocals and the music is just like beating the hell out of you the entire time. You know, especially toward the end. But
and then we will end this set with Sickening Art, which is one of my favorite songs on the whole record. A lot of Iron Maiden melodies sort of sprinkled throughout, but like almost through like the eyes of like how Autopsy would do like Iron Maiden riffs or something. Like, it's just it's not right. It's like something off about it. And that blast beat at the end is again one of I think Etsby's shining moments on the whole record. It's very Shreds of Flesh-esque, like from Entombed, where it's just so blindingly fast, but yet like groove laden almost still, too. So
it has a very anarcho-punk vibe on it.
Yeah, that deep beat is kind of like built into that. So, all right, so enjoy Dismembered, Skinner Alive, and Sickening Art. That's Sickening Art, Skinner Alive, and Dismembered. So then we get to the epic conclusion of this record, Mark, and it's a different one. In all, it's as different as Override the Overture is epic and kind of quintessential. In Death's Sleep, which is a pretty interesting song, I guess.
It's a really nice kind of bookend to, or way to end the record, kind of the anti-way that it started. This kind of like epic, it's going to keep, going on, like almost the legacy of what's to come kind of song.
It's got a lot of, there's some keyboards texturizing things here and there. A lot of solos that aren't necessarily brutal, but darker. There's like a darker tone to like everything,
Dark triumphant kind of vibe or something. So weird.
Nicky, especially like his last kind of great bluesy solo at the end, that's probably some of the best stuff I've ever heard Nicky do.
Yeah.
It's very weighty in a heavy sense, what I mean? Like it sounds important almost,
Yeah. Like even the way the guitar, like those single notes that are held out, the way they decay is similar to like how Left Hand Path, that really thick bottom end kind of vibe.
Yeah, it's almost their like Left Hand Path song. Yeah. In a sense,
Except they didn't steal the theme from Phantasm.
They did not.
Which is the best horror theme in my opinion.
Yeah. And there's just so much crunch in the rhythm guitars too, like which harkens back to some of the crunch that you heard like on Torn Apart earlier from Carnage. So it's kind of like the band kind of coming full circle, very introspective and forward looking, I guess, which you didn't hear from a band as young as these guys probably back then. To have so much, I don't know, perspective maybe on where they were going to go beyond this.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you got the great kind of Fred Edspy, spoken word at the beginning, which kind of adds to that weightiness or that epicness without kind of coming off cheesy, Yeah,
and I don't think there's been speculation on where that came from. Some people think it came out of some like Bible verse.
But it was like tweaked. An ever-flowing stream kind of thing.
But it was kind of, I think, tweaked a little bit, but...
Yeah, it is such an odd title,
And it was just that was one of the big things that it's kind of a weird title to begin with, and to see because like Left Hand Path, okay, that kind of makes sense. Robert Frost reading that in high school, that kind of gets you to the path or the road
plus
less taken,
left hand
kind of
is the hand of the devil, and that kind of.
But then like an ever-flowing stream, it was just this weird kind of visual, especially when you look at the cover, where it's like. I don't know, these weird like canine-looking monsters barfing water into, this like Cthulhu-looking head thing.
Yeah.
And then there's all this kind of like
lava.
I don't know what it is. Almost there's like stuff in it, like creatures like kind of emerging like this primordial ooze or something. But
it's very Lovecraftian in a sense,
Yeah, and if you just use the title like an ever-flowing stream, it could sound like a prog kind of album title or something, but that always kind of struck us as being weird.
Yeah,
and kind of like drawing you into the whole idea of what this was.
What bands do you think probably drew upon this record as their sort of blueprint, maybe more than like the Entombed did? In hindsight, as you've sort of seen the impact this record's had throughout the last 20 years.
And it was weird because that whole era, all those people were so interconnected. And I think a lot of these bands kind of established a little bit of their own sound before there was a scene.
And stuff, yeah.
Yeah, like at the demo stage. I'm sure half of a lot of the Wrong Again record stuff has some of it. Like Nagelfar, I can hear a little bit of it in there. A lot of the U.S. Kind of like the hardcore revival stuff, like the death metal revival stuff, I can hear it there. Mm-hmm. Death Evocation, that band out of California,
which takes their name directly from one of the bonus tracks that you would probably find if you purchased Path today, or like a Overflowing Stream.
There's because I know it's influential as Entombed was, but you don't necessarily hear it as much as you hear the Autopsy effect on these guys.
Yeah,
I
not as direct, maybe.
Yeah.
Something. It's just, I guess, did you ever get the feeling like, as you sort of look back, that these guys got the shaft because they were a year late? Or do you think that that's come full circle and they've gotten their comeuppance now in terms of being a respected kind of contributing member of the Swedish death metal scene? Or
I think, it's they did that tour. What was it? I think it was with Unleashed.
Oh, Unleashed, Grave, and Entombed, right?
I don't know if Entombed was in it or not.
Maybe it was just
might have been, but it's basically this like the kind of Gods of Death Metal tour again, and I know that was kind of pumped them up a little bit more. But I think they're almost one of those bands that just like purveyors of it. I think hold in higher regard more than maybe fans. I don't know. It's weird because I don't know a whole lot of people that are into Dismember, to tell you the truth. I was talking. Went to a show at a college campus last week, and talking to a kid outside about Dismember, and he'd only heard Where Iron Crosses Grow, and then some of the other, some random smatterings of stuff that he, got off the internet, and it's. I think people are still kind of rediscovering them all over again. Even people I know that are into metal are not necessarily like, there's like, oh, I just kind of like bypassed Dismember because they sounded ridiculous.
Yeah.
But
it's interesting that because they've kind of almost had the same kind of approach as like a Bolt Thrower has. In that, like, they've sort of, I don't want to say made the same record over and over again, but it's been pretty, like, thematic.
They have a formula like Aerosmith or AC/DC has a formula, Iron Maiden has a formula. I think they have, like, key riffs.
Yeah.
And they've never really ventured too far. Like, Massive Killing Capacity was the furthest I think they ever kind of stretched out. Mm-hmm. And then, especially that last record, I think it was just self-titled.
Dismember, yeah.
Fantastic. Like, just this, they had the same kind of like raw energy that this record had to it. Not to the same extent, but there was a kind of like a breath of fresh air.
That
have been around for 20 years. Yeah.
So there's a lot to be discovered with these guys, and hopefully, taking a closer, microscopic look at this record can maybe open some eyes to some, people out there that maybe have always heard of these guys as like a copycat band of Entombed, or who knows what people have said about Dismember, or maybe just have never really heard much about them. Because I mean, some of these older bands in the metal scene, if they're not, I don't know, if they're not out on tour a lot, if they're not like really drawing a lot of attention to themselves, they kind of just sort of chug along, and a lot of new people don't necessarily glob onto them or discover what they're all about.
Similarly to Dismember, I mean, Unleashed have never really gotten a whole lot of respect, even though they were kind of one of the first bands to really start the whole Viking craze. I mean, Amon Amarth owes a lot to Unleashed.
Almost everything.
And Unleashed back in the day were touring their asses off. I mean, we saw them like 3 or 4 times in the span of a couple years. I saw Dismember once. But a lot of those bands, I think Entombed they're on such a high. They had such name recognition. They were like
Earache, Columbia deal, and the Marvel Comics crossover. I mean,
and so even like the Grind Crusher tour with them, and then there was they'd have like write-ups in like Thrasher magazine and stuff. They were always, it was Entombed and Carcass were two of the big acts back in that day that I think really got a lot of like mainstream attention as far as people like acknowledged it as something beyond just noise or garbage.
Sure. So Dismember's kind of like the Roy Orbison of the late 50s rock and roll. Kind of not really respected, but heartfelt and
and has a hell of a legacy now.
Yeah, exactly, and an impact for sure.
I mean, Chris Isaak and Danzig wouldn't exist without Orbison.
There you go. Yeah, and many Swedish death metal bands and American death metal bands and European in general wouldn't exist without like an ever-flowing stream. That's for sure. So. All right, cool. Well, let us know what you thought. We haven't been getting the executive producers. We have one lined up, I think, for the next episode, possibly. But still, we're looking to hear from some people.
And I know the economy sucks, but we got bills to pay,
and we're gotta support the arts.
Exactly. If the government's going to take away NPR's money, we got to ask you, the listener. Without you, I mean, we'd still be doing this without support, obviously. But
as we have been for years. So
in this economy, it's yet something else that you got to take out of your pocket and pay for web hosting costs and everything else. So it's incredibly helpful, and it's like a nice pat on the back when we get an executive producership. So.
Sure, yeah, and we'd like to hear from you guys. Send us an email at requiempodcast@gmail.com. Check us out on iTunes. Leave us a star rating. We've actually gotten, I mean, the last, God, I almost wanted to read the last iTunes kind of comment that was put in there, like on the air, because it was so like
there's been some good stuff. We've got, I'm not sure how many ratings we have, but we've got like a 5-star rating, I think, right now.
Perfect scores and stuff. So, and then check us out on Facebook, Mark and Jason.
Or, what would even be great is if, like the economy sucks, you can't afford to help us out. What would be great is if you tell a friend about it or push it on your blog or on your Facebook page, because a lot of people you get emails from, they're like, where has this been?
Sure. Yeah.
So that's something, with doing the show, the, pre-prep, post-production, all that, it's tough to like get into forums and get the word out. So if anybody out there,
cyberspace is so big out there, it's hard to it's hard for us to maybe sometimes stand out above the other fray, because we're not whoring ourselves out too often and things like that. So
if you're on the metal, some kind of like metal forums, fly the flag of Requiem Metal Podcast, that would be fantastic and appreciated.
And if you like some of this stuff a little bit more too, we've got merch and stuff on the website, requiempodcast.com. If you're into the artistic side of things, Mark has a lot of his really cool like decibel artwork up there.
If you go to markrudolph.com and click on the store link, I've got links to a lot of my decibel illustrations, the actual original art from those. Like there's an Electric Wizard and a couple of other things are up for sale now. And what better way to show your appreciation?
There you go. Hang in the bathroom.
Exactly.
Nothing nicer than peeing and looking at Electric Wizard.
Well, and you don't just have to have your posters around. You can have a piece of real art.
That's true.
On your wall that still shows how much you like metal.
That's for sure. So we hope you enjoyed Dismember and Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, and we think it's a worthy addition into the Requiem, I guess, Hall of Fame, if you will. And for In Death, Sleep, and Dismember, I'm Jason.
And I'm Mark.
From dream to dream, you have always been like an ever-flowing stream.